we'll move on to group dynamics, which is just the notion that groups are kind of, they're made up of people. Just like we said, all of society, whether it's groups or organizations or institutions, are at its core made up of people. But groups not only are the sum of the behaviors of the people within them, they also kind of behave on their own as well. So we can look at behavior of individuals within groups, but we can also look at the behavior of groups themselves. And when we look at that, we see that there are some interesting patterns that emerge in terms of group dynamics. Which is the start of segment 2. So groups behave on their own in terms of how they form, how they function, and how they interact. When we talk about group dynamics, we're literally studying how groups form, how groups function, and how groups interact. How they form, how they function, and how they interact. And what sociologists have found is that groups form, groups function, and groups interact in very predictable and patterned ways. So whether it's a group of friends or a family group or a business that sells widgets or a group of people that are sports fans or what have you, common to them are the ways that they form, the ways that they function, and how interactions occur within them. So sociologists have found similarities across very, very different groups of people. So in terms of formation, groups tend to form when people agree upon distinguishing characteristics that they can separate into those that belong in the group and those that do not belong in the group. Those that belong in the group and those that don't belong in the group. So groups tend to form based on distinguished, shared categorical characteristics. So if we relate this back to the beginning of the lecture, sociologists importantly distinguish between aggregates, categories, and social groups. And what we find is that social groups kind of emerge from categories. They emerge from categories that are distinguished. And when social groups form, they can grow in size and they can shrink in size. But when we find that they grow, as groups continually grow in size, unwaveringly, they will form small subgroups. The larger the group, the more likely it is that subgroups form within that larger group. So if we go back to the example of a fraternity or sorority, or if we go back to the example of a university, these are examples of very large secondary groups. And within those very large secondary groups, I am 100% sure that there are smaller groups that have formed within that larger group. So if you take a sorority or fraternity, you'll be able to see dyads and triads and quadrads, right? Groups of 2, 3, 4 people who are best friends or who are friends within that larger fraternity or sorority structure. And that is really a product of that fraternity or sorority growing large enough in size for smaller groups to form. In terms of common functions, the first thing that we see is that as groups form, we start to see almost immediately the emergence of leadership within that group. So leadership emerges early on. It is very, very difficult, nay impossible, sociologists would say, to have a group that is leaderless. A group that is leaderless. Leadership, whether it's formal leadership or informal leadership, emerges early in the formation of a group, and then the leadership of that group guides its actions. So even in small primary groups, we see leadership emerge. Amongst your friends, your closest group of best friends, you may be all considered equals in the eyes of each other, but there's likely a leader that influences who, where, when, and under what circumstances your activities will occur. And this is absolutely true for large secondary groups. Right? Leadership emerges, formalizes, and becomes part of the organization. At IUP, we have a leader. His name is President Driscoll. And what he says typically goes. Right? So leadership emerges and helps to guide the actions of the groups. But leadership is not there unchecked. So sociologists have found not only does leadership emerge, but coalitions form within groups. So coalitions form within groups and engage in what we call micropolitics. So there may be a leader in your friendship group, but sometimes, if there's just 3 of you in the group, sometimes the 2 of you who are not leaders may kind of get together and gang up on the leader and change the course of action for the group. In organizations, large ones like IUP, the president doesn't just make decisions unchecked. There are formal coalitions here, including a coalition known as faculty senators. There's a coalition of students, the student council or student government. There's coalitions of other groups on campus as well that all kind of emerge and engage in activities to influence that president's decision-making process and to influence the decision-making process of the university. So this is what is called micropolitics. At the large societal level, we see an entire institution. The institution of government forms around the creation and distribution of social power. But within groups, we see micropolitics occur. People wrestling and struggling for group power, right? Wrestling and struggling for group power. So it's not just that leaders emerge and they stay there. They emerge and they continually kind of engage in micropolitics to either keep that power, or if they're not any good at it, they'll lose that power. And then finally, groups invariably interact in patterned ways. So sociologists note that behavior as well as information travels differently depending on how a group is structured. So information travels differently depending on the structure of the group. So even in small, primary, informal groups, information travels differently depending on who you are in that group structure. And this is especially true for large formal groups that are very rigidly organized. Information will travel differently depending on how that group is organized. And the types of interactions, their level of formality or their informality, is typically dependent on a person's place within that group structure. Right? Their interactions are dependent on their place in that group structure. So if we think about it, you will interact very differently if you have an opportunity to sit down with the president of the university than the provost will interact with that president if he has an opportunity or she has an opportunity to sit down with the president of the university. Your interactions with the president are likely going to be more formal and more deferential, right? The provost will be less formal and less deferential. So the types of our interactions change based on our place within the group, as well as how information travels within the group. So if you are the president, the provost, or the deans of the college, here on campus, you're likely going to get very important information about the university first. Because information in a formal organization like IUP travels from the top down. And it also travels from the bottom up. So who was one of the last people to know about IU Patty's Day? The president of the university. That information traveled amongst all of the members of the student body first, and then it kind of trickled up through the ranks of the professorate to the deans and eventually the president. And by the time the president knew, it was too gosh darn late. Right? It's too gosh darn late. So this is what we mean by group dynamics. How interactions occur are based on the group and its behavior itself. How groups form is not dependent on any individual in the group. It's based on these general principles around how groups form. And how groups function are based around these general principles about how groups function. It doesn't have to do with any one person per se within that group. Y'all following me? Show your hands if you're following me. Oh, beautiful. Beautiful. So whether it's a friendship group or a work group, any type of group, we can see some commonalities across these variety of different groups. And this is the process known as group dynamics. Importantly, we ended on interaction on Monday. And when we talked about social interaction, we mentioned that depending on how the group is structured, right, who knows who within that social group, interactions will travel very differently along that chain of group members. And also, the status of people within that group, who is more powerful and less powerful in that group, is going to influence how information travels throughout that social group. And we want to expand a little bit on that today, because sociologists really find that communication or the sharing of information is actually a very, very important factor when it comes to driving behavior, right? Driving behavior. So sociologists have come up with an entire subfield in which we study the ways in which information travels throughout social groups. And we call this the analysis of social networks, right? Network analysis. Network analysis. Social network analysis concentrates on the shape and composition of groups and how the shape and composition of a social group will determine how information travels throughout that group. So when we think about social network analysis, we tend to think about computer science folks, right? People that are studying social networks that are electronically mediated social networks. You know, the people who research and develop Facebook, the people who research and develop Twitter, who research and develop Instagram or LinkedIn for the more professional social network. When we think about social networks as in our common everyday language, we tend to think about these online mediated social networks. But in fact, sociologists have been studying social networks before the invention of the computer, right? We've been studying social networks as part of the bread and butter of the field of sociology since its inception. So how networks get created and how information travels throughout those networks. In doing so, sociologists use two very important concepts, the concept of network nodes and the concept of interpersonal ties. So you have to remember those, nodes and ties. A network node typically, most typically, represents a person within a social network. A network node most typically represents a person within a social network. And the interpersonal ties represent, in the study of social networks, the relationship of information sharing. The relationship of information sharing. So a tie can be unidirectional or bidirectional, meaning information can come from one person to another person, or information can be shared between two people. You can think of instances where people tell you information, but you can't talk back to them. And you can think of instances where you share information between two people. The important thing that sociologists note about network ties is that they can be both strong and weak. Strong network ties are when contact is frequent and information is shared often. So if you think about your own social network or any group that you belong to, there's some people in that social group that you talk to or communicate with fairly frequently. And then there's other people that you may share information with or communicate with fairly infrequently. So sociologists note that this is actually the tie, the informational tie between people. In social groups, sometimes we interact regularly, sometimes we interact infrequently, and in some social groups, with some members, we won't interact with at all. Right? We won't interact with at all. So ties can be strong, weak, or non-existent between different members of a social network. And this is going to influence how information travels within that social network, how quickly and how completely someone can gain access to important information for their participation in that group life. So, give you a great example of this. Here we have an example of the social network of the university. Right? At least the employees of the university. Information travels along these different lines. Right? Travels along these different nodes. So here, in this particular example, we have a node to represent the president of the university, the provost, the vice president of student affairs, and then we have nodes to represent other types of employees like the deans, the department chairs, and then faculty members. And we can think about information traveling in differing directions. A faculty member doesn't necessarily have access directly to communicate with the president. And it's actually rare and infrequent that a faculty member will directly communicate with the president. The ties between the president and any given faculty member are either weak or non-existent. But the provost and the vice president of student affairs have very strong ties with the president. They communicate with the president very frequently and share information very often. So you can think about the information sharing that goes on within this network almost like a game of telephone. Right? Almost like a game of telephone. The president gives a directive to the provost. The provost then gives directives to all of the deans. The deans then give directives to all of the different department chairs. And then that information trickles down to the faculty. And sometimes we'll move to the student body after that from the faculty. So from the time that the president makes a decision to the time that all of the individual faculty members are informed, it may be a long period of time, because that information has to pass through each of those deans, each of those chairs, and then down to the individual faculty members. So it may be a long period of time between the emergence of a piece of information to the final person in that social network knows about that information. Similarly, as I mentioned in last class, information travels up this network as well. It doesn't just travel down, it's bidirectional. So when information starts, maybe at the level of the student body, it may take a very long time for that information to travel upwards and reach the president. As in the case of IU Patty's Day, right? IU Patty's Day was already planned, all of the students knew about it, they were ready to go and have fun during that IU Patty's Day celebration. And really the last person to know about this occurrence was the president of the university. And he was caught off guard by the fact that thousands of people came to Indiana, came to IUP, and essentially participated in activities that made the university look, not so good. So why was the president the last person to know? It's because information travels along the network. That information started at the student body and didn't necessarily reach the president until the very end, right? Until the very end. So why is sharing of information important? Well, if we use sociological theories, we'll be able to figure out why sharing information is very important. From the functionalist perspective, networks are going to create functions and dysfunctions, right? The way in which the social network at the university has been created, it is not organic. It was deliberately created to protect or insulate the president from students, from faculty, and from deans in his or her decision making. And similarly, it's to protect students from the administration, and it is created to protect the faculty from both the administration and from the student body. So we're not all bombarded with information from people every day, right? The networks are created so that certain information will travel and other information will not travel, right? The important information will travel up, important information will travel down, but other than that, the kind of noise information stays at the level of the student body, stays at the level of the professorate, stays at the level of the chairs, stays at the level of the provost or the president. So from a functionalist perspective, we can see that creating a social network in a very deliberate manner serves a function. The most important stuff moves up and down, and the stuff that isn't need to know doesn't move up and down. But it also creates dysfunctions, right? The president probably needed to know about IU Patty's Day. Right? It was a huge embarrassment to the university. IUP made national news as a result of IU Patty's Day. And all the way up to our state legislators were talking about the misbehavior on campus and how the university needed to get its act in order. So the president probably needed to know that information and try his best to be able to stop or stem those celebrations during IU Patty's Day. So we can see that the network itself sometimes creates dysfunctions. So from the functionalist perspective, we can say networks provide functions, important information travels where it's needed, but it also has dysfunctions. Sometimes important information doesn't reach where it needs to go, particularly because the network is created the way that it is. Right? Now, I've had students in previous classes say, well, we all have email now, right? And we all have email, and so basically I can email the president, you can email the president, etc. Well, we have to remember that information is perceived as important or not important. So just because we have the ability to send email to everyone doesn't mean that that particular person is going to be reading that email or even thinking about that email as being important. So if we take the example of IU Patty's Day, I'm sure that there were emails that went into the president's and provost and vice president of academic affairs inbox about that celebration, but were either disregarded or not deemed important because it did not travel along the proper chain to demonstrate that it's important. So in addition to using the functionalist perspective and noting that information can be important because it provides functions and dysfunctions for groups. Conflict theory would say that understanding how information travels, because information is a form of social power, right? It's a resource, right? Information is a resource. And so conflict theory says that groups compete for resources. Groups compete for resources. So if we think about conflict theory, the network design creates a form of stratification where some people know a lot more information and a lot of important information early on, and other people don't learn that information until much later, or even at all. So if we think about how our economy works, right? Our economy has vast series of information sharing networks within it. And oftentimes, if you get knowledge about a particular business or a particular invention or a particular type of service that's going to be provided, and you can get early in on that investment, you may be able to make lots and lots of money. So in our economy, money isn't just shared, information is shared. And that information can lead to people making lots of money, or if you don't have access to that information, you may miss out on investments. Right? So information is a very important game in terms of resources that are shared within a society. So information is very important, not just from a functionalist perspective, but for a conflict theorist perspective as well. Okay? By show of hands, how many of y'all have followed me so far? Oh, excellent, excellent. Love it. So in addition to groups being important because of their information, groups are also important because there is an emergence of leadership within groups. So sociologists study leadership in addition to studying how groups share information and in addition to how groups kind of function generally. Right? Function generally. In fact, IUP, Sociology Department, has a PhD program that is focused on the study of leadership. So if you want to think about how important leadership is to sociologists, we offer PhDs to people who are skilled in understanding how leadership emerges and functions within groups. And in a lot of ways, if you go to the business schools, if you go down to the Eberly College of Business and get an MBA, or if you go to Harvard and get an MBA, one of the important parts of that MBA program is going to be studying leadership, specifically in businesses. So leadership is an important field of study in regards to the study of groups. So sociologists note that there are different types of leaders. First is the instrumental leader, which is a leader who keeps the group on track towards meeting their goals. And then second is the expressive leader, which is a type of leadership that tries to keep the group morale together and to keep them motivated. So one type of leadership is focused on getting the group to do what they're supposed to do. The other type of leadership is focused on making sure that everybody is okay within the group, that their morale is high, that their emotions are good, and that they're motivated. Being an instrumental leader does not necessarily mean that you cannot be an expressive leader. And being an expressive leader doesn't mean that you cannot be an instrumental leader. So sometimes, a leader of a group will serve both the instrumental and expressive roles. They'll keep people motivated, and they'll also keep people on track to accomplishing the group's goals. You're a really good leader if you can pull off both instrumental and expressive tasks. Because it's really hard to make a person feel good while you're telling them to get their ass in gear and do their work. Right? You have to be a really good leader to do that. So typically groups will have somebody that's a leader that goes around and tells people, get your ass in gear and get to work. And then there'll be another person that provides that expressive role that says, Yes, are you okay? I know you just got yelled at. How do you feel? Let's get motivated, etc. Sometimes you can be both. You can be motivating and raise morale, and at the same time get people to work as hard as they can. But oftentimes that role or that status goes to two different people within the group. Y'all following me there? I hope you never have a boss that tells you to get your ass in gear and get to work. But some of you may. And then you just have to say, well, he or she's just being an expressive, or being an instrumental leader, and he or she's just not very good at expressive leadership. So now you can say something nice about that person instead of going home and being like, that person is a jerk. Right? Okay. In addition to different types of leaders, there's different styles of leadership as well. Different types as well as different styles. So one style of leadership is authoritarian leadership style. An authoritarian leader typically gives instruction without very little input being given or being taken. So an authoritarian leader kind of tells the group what to do, and an authoritarian leader rarely listens to the group. They have a vision, and they have a goal, and they get a group together and pushes that group to fulfill that vision or goal. You know, a lot of people say that folks like Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg or Steve Jobs were authoritarian leaders. Right? Steve Jobs had a vision about what Apple would look like. Steve Jobs had a vision about what Apple would do for the world, and Steve Jobs tried to fulfill that vision. And if you didn't like Steve Jobs' vision, you don't work for Apple. You get out. You know, Jobs would say, follow or get out. Right? Follow or get out. Very famous military leader, George MacArthur, authoritarian leader, said famously, right, lead, follow, or get out of the way. Lead, follow, or get out of my way. Authoritarian leaders are the folks who have a vision, have a goal, and they push the group towards fulfilling that goal without getting input from that group. Democratic leaders try to gain a consensus. Try to gain a consensus for the group. So they'll put together proposals, they'll get feedback, they'll incorporate that feedback, and then they'll move forward towards that goal. In the US, our government is designed as a democratic government, which is supposed to lead through this consensus process. Right, we have a leader of our country, the executive, right, the president of the United States, and the president is supposed to put forward proposals to Congress, and they get information back from Congress in the form of bills that then he will move forward on by signing into law and executing them. Right? He's part of the executive branch. He's in charge of getting the things done. Getting the things done. So democratic leadership is leadership that tries to gain consensus with the group. And then finally, laissez-faire, which is a fancy French word that just means leave it be, is a type of leadership that is totally hands-off. Allows the group really to make decisions on its own, with very little input, very little help, very little, pushing in one direction or another along the way. You know, at the university is really a laissez-faire type of leadership structure. You know, the president of the university will put forward some strategic goals for the university that he or she would like to accomplish. But generally, faculty members like myself are in charge of determining what we're going to research, when we're going to research it, what we're going to teach, when we're going to teach it, how we're going to teach in the classroom, how we're going to put together our research projects, it's largely we are self-determined, rather than having someone above us, like our boss, the chair of the department, or our dean, our boss's boss, say, you're going to research this, you're going to teach this, you're going to do this or do that. So laissez-faire is really hands-off leadership. It allows the group to kind of determine itself. There are advantages and disadvantages to different leadership styles. One is not inherently worse than the other. One is not inherently better than the other. What is true is that some styles of leadership will lead to functions from the functionalist perspective and dysfunctions.